the APEC. I welcome all the speakers and moderators, and of course, fellow APEC leaders, but more importantly, all the delegates who are here today to APEC 2018 Papua New Guinea CEO Summit. This is a great event of great importance to Papua New Guinea and the APEC region. You are remarkably well placed to help secure a stronger future for our region, and I look forward to embracing this unique opportunity and a greater shared opportunity. Thank you, and have a great day. Thank you very much.
On stage.
Thank you, Prime Minister Peter O'Neill, for those thoughtful remarks and for your leadership. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats as we prepare for the next session.
We have a fantastic program ahead of us today, which will feature pressing current global issues and topics. This evening, you will also be treated to a very special reception, the APEC CEO Summit Gala Festival, which will showcase the magnificent culture and heritage of Papua New Guinea.
Also, if you're wondering what those little black boxes are next to your armrests, they're interpreter devices. So channel 1 is in English, channel 2 is for Mandarin, channel 3 is for Russian, and channel 4 is Spanish.
As we wait for our stage to be set, ladies and gentlemen, if you are staying with us longer here in Port Moresby, a few things that you might like to visit. I personally enjoy going to the Nature Park, which is out by the University of PNG. Matthew?
I think I would recommend visiting the National Museum, which has recently been renovated and open to the public, which is right by the Parliament House.
Very exciting.
Now, I think we're ready to start. We would now like to introduce session 2. The future of globalization is a new approach required. This dialogue will focus on economic integration and cooperation within the context of rising protectionist pressures and anti-globalization sentiment.
May we invite to the stage Mr. Raymond Chow, Asia Pacific Chairman of PwC, Mr. Yi Xiaoxin, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization,
Mr. Donald Campbell, International Co-Chair of Pacific Economic Cooperation Council and Senior Strategy Advisor of DLA Piper, Mr. Tae-Shin Kwon, Vice Chairman and CEO of the Federation of Korean Industries.
and the session moderator, Ms. Tian Wei, anchor and host with CGTN.
Thank you very much, our moderators. Can you hear me? Good, thanks. My name is Tian Wei, moderator and host of China Global Television Network, also known as CGTN. Before we start this discussion, may I, ladies and gentlemen, I can call upon you to put your hands together to express our appreciation for the host country, Papua New Guinea, and the efforts they've been making in order to make this happen. Shall we? Thank you so much. And I also know that there are a lot of friends from the other economies of APEC that have been of utmost support for this event as well. So our appreciation to them too. May I start by introducing the name of the panel, which is about trade and globalization. As you can see, the Asia-Pacific region boasts about 50% of the global trade, 40% global population, 60% of the GDP. So it's a huge area. The thought that's going on here will have a big impact for the rest of the world. But what's happening in the world over the past few years, if not just past few months? Rise of protectionism, anti-global sentiment, and apparently some economies looking at national interest as the only priority for setting up policies both at home and internationally. And as a result of that, people are wondering, where are we going? And what's happening to our systems, international governance systems? Can we up them, update them? What can we do about them? Well, those are mind-boggling questions, and I don't have an answer to that, but we do have a very strong panel, and they are going to help us to understand the questions better. From my very left, Mr. Yi Xiaojun, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Hello. Over there, Raymond Chow, Asia Pacific Chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers. And also Donald Campbell, International Co-Chair of Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, Senior Strategy Advisor for DLA Piper. Last but not least, we have Tae-Shin Kwong, the Vice Chairman and CEO of Federation of Korean Industry. Welcome to all of you. They say a minute of thought is better than an hour of talk. But our hour of talk is going to be based on a lot of thoughts. So let's start by asking the very first question to Mr. Yi, since you're sitting on my very left side. From the WTO's perspective, what's going on and what went wrong? You know,
well,
a general question is the best way to start it.
I think we can use 2 words to characterize the current situation: uncertainty and tensions. As you may know that the tariffs escalation is worrying everybody. And those tariffs, if implemented, it will have a huge impact on both trade, investment, and the global economy. That's why it's a big concern to our WTO members. So they are talking about what we can do to address the issue, because those new tariffs will, as you may see from the audience, a lot of business people are already holding off on their investment decision.
Yes.
And we can see the export order are on the decline. That's why we are so concerned. And in response, WTO already revised its forecast of trade growth for this year from earlier forecast of 4.4% downward to 3.9%. So that's the problem we're facing.
It sounds quite worrisome. Mr. Chow, I understand you and your organization has been doing a survey, rather 2 surveys. One is during the summertime, the other is most recent October. So from the business perspective, particularly business people here in the Asia Pacific region and also from the US, what have you found out? Does that correlate with what Mr. Yi said?
And it does and it doesn't. It's actually quite interesting. So PwC has been doing this survey for a number of years now. So every year, I think this year's survey is actually, to me, is sort of most interesting because of the interesting times that we're in at this point. And some of the findings are actually quite intriguing. Mm-hmm. And but you know, so let me put it into perspectives first. So this is the voice of the business community. So we surveyed close to 1,200 CEOs and business leaders across 21 APEC economies. And the period that we covered, the first one, as you mentioned, Tian, was between early May to early July. So July 10 or 15th, right? So that approximately that 2 months period. But a lot was changing during that time, before and after.
That's right.
So we did do a catch up, a second round, but with a smaller population because of time and everything. We had to get it done before the APEC Summit. But the finding is actually quite interesting. Let me just highlight a few points. First of all, despite the uncertainties, the trade tensions we all hear and we all see, we all feel at this point, the CEOs are telling us that they are still relatively confident about the future growth in the next 12 months. Right? So if you look at the survey, 35% of our CEOs across the 21 APEC economies are very confident about revenue growth over the next 12 months. Now that's a slight drop compared to 2017, but it's a 2 percentage points drop. So that's a very interesting fact, I think. Now, putting it back to perspective, so that was done, so the survey was finished at the beginning of July, and if you remember, I think it was July 6th was the first US tariff on Chinese imports, right? And actually, if we dig deeper into the survey, what we found was just right after that, the survey results showed that the confidence level dropped 10%. So this is quite a big drop. So it tells you that the business community is actually very sensitive to the trade tension at this point. And if you look deeper into the analysis, what it is also showing is that the US and the Thailand CEOs are actually very confident, way above the average of 35%. They're into the 50%. You know, one is 57, the other one is 56 respectively, in terms of their confidence level in terms of revenue growth in the next 12 months. The other end of the spectrum is China and Mexico. Actually, the two countries which have the largest trade volume with the US, their confidence level is actually way below the average. You're talking about China is at 25% and Mexico was at 21%. So these are very interesting. So you see, despite a 35%, it actually is a wide spectrum of how people at the confidence level. But one thing that is very clear, the business community is very sensitive to trade tensions. And all businesses, no businesses like uncertainties. But the survey is showing at this point that overall, it's still not too bad at that time, at that period of time.
Right.
So maybe I'll just pause there until...
I know you have a big content in the survey. Maybe we divide it into several parts and share it with our audience.
Yeah.
Let me go to you, Mr. Campbell. Of course, your organization is mainly about the Pacific Rim economies. What do you see as the biggest challenge? You have a mixed picture already being expressed by the two gentlemen on the stage. Confidence, well, maybe not. Some countries, well, others. What's your sense?
Well, the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council has recently done a major survey. We do this every year, and it was done last month, so it's very recent. And it's a targeted survey for business decision makers, for policy makers in government, and for academia and civil society, with over 600 responses. 2 or 3 things came out from that in terms of the top challenges for APEC. And the first at the top of the list is concern about protectionism and the need to address the issues that we have in the WTO. Now this is quite striking because last year the number of people who put that as a priority, it was number 25. It was way down the list. Only 5% of the respondents thought that was an issue. And it had been declining over the years. And I think in part it was because people tended with the non-successful end of the Doha round that the World Trade Organization was just sort of over there. And people were starting to realize that with the threats that we now have to the dispute settlement processes, to the things that businesses are concerned about, that this better move rapidly up the ladder. A couple of other things. One, there was a very considered view from that survey that APEC has to pay more attention and address in a more coherent way the issues around economic growth, sustainable, inclusive economic growth, and not just the trade and the investment set of issues. So that I think was another important message that came out of there. You know, it's clear that globalization, it's like the ocean waves. It's going to continue. The issue is the threats that we're having right now really are the threats to institutional side of globalization. And if I do say, I don't think that that is a view, in spite of the increasing protectionist sentiment, I don't think it's widely shared in populations. I don't think it's driven. Obviously, Mr. Trump and his actions are not, he's not the cause of concern, he's an expression of that concern. But it's being driven politically rather than uprising from the populations. And poll after poll in the United States, for example, indicates that most Americans are approving of trade, and a significant number have no view on trade, and very few are against trade.
Okay, I think we already checked the picture, right, from every one of you. And let's go to Mr. Kwong. I don't want to check the reality with you anymore because I think you pretty much agree. It seems like you've been nodding your head most of the time. So let me ask you about that. Your economy, South Korea, has been one transforming itself from developing to a developed economy. Of course, trade has been an absolute winning strategy for you. With your experience with the governments for decades and policy making, is this history repeated? Or this is a very different picture that we are looking at right now?
That's a very difficult question.
Well, I'm glad I asked you a difficult question.
But I'm very much worried and concerned. History repeats. So that is the reason why we should do our best not to make history repeat again. Because we have achieved the great things, the rule of law, free trade, and the mutual prosperity in the world after World War II, 1945. The percentage of world population below the absolute poverty used to be 60%, but last year it went down 10%. We have achieved great things, reducing poverty, mutual prosperity globally. As Korea, in 1961, when we first started the economic development program, our per capita GDP was 81 US dollars, much lower than any of the country, the poorest country, lower than the Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia. But now Korea is 11th largest economy. Our per capita GDP almost 30,000 US dollars. And also the 7th largest trading country. It's all because of good international free trade architecture like WTO, like IMF, World Bank issues. But our biggest concern, because 26% of our export goes to China, including Hong Kong, it's about 37%, whilst our export goes to USA, 10%. So if you go back to old system, like instead of rule of law, rule of force, instead of multilateralism, bilateralism, instead of free trade, protectionism, and nationalism, and some country first policy, we'll go backward. I'm very much concerned about it.
It's a very interesting case study Mr. Kwong just shared with us. It's one of those 21 economies in this region. And we want to bear in mind, among those in the region, developing, developed economy, mixed, emerging economy as well. So, Mr. Yi, I want to come back to you about that. What can the international governance system do as a result of, you heard different calls, you heard also confidence to a certain degree among business community, but dramatic change as a result of trade protectionism policies. So what can international governance system do, such as the WTO?
I'm very much appreciative of your comments, because the current tensions can be addressed only by global governance, and the WTO is one of the major pillars of this global governance. And check with the history. I mean, history shows that in the past 70 years, WTO and its predecessor GATT provided stability and predictability to global trade. It guarantees the peaceful solution of trade disputes. So I think WTO is essential and indispensable.
But Mr. Yi, if I could, I'm sure the audience would also notice similar phenomenon. Over the past few years, we see changes going on with how economies are using or working with WTO, let's just put it that way. For example, the steel and aluminum trade war that's going on and going to the WTO. You also have the appellate body likely to collapse next year if there's no judges in the appellate body. And then you also have things like politics becoming the central of the legal case going to WTO rather than trade and economic issues. So, from WTO's perspective, what can you do with your members in order to make sure it's not going that direction?
Well, number one, I think I fully agree with Donald that the current survey shows that during the crisis, people realize the value of multilateral trading system. And number two, we know that WTO is not perfect. We have our own problem, and we have concerns by our members about dispute settlement, about appellate body impasse. But our members are seriously engaged with each other, and they talk to each other to find a solution. I think that's a very important exercise. And finally, I think you cannot have any alternative to address those global issues other than WTO. You cannot address your trade concerns or trade challenges through bilateral discussions or through regional institution. So the only thing we can do is to safeguard the multilateralism and strengthen it.
But can it be done? I'll go to you, Mr. Kwong, but Mr. Campbell, can it be done to safeguard a multilateral platform such as WTO and others as well? Well, APEC, for example, is one of those multilateral platform, and that's why we're all here. 28 years ago, that was established for free trade, and now what are we looking at?
I'm very concerned because I think that with the stalemate in any possibility on adding panel members to the dispute settlement provision, that in the next, I don't know exactly, next 6 months, next 12 months, the dispute settlement process will come to a halt. And I don't see any resolution, quite frankly, of that before then, because the way in which the World Trade Organization operates, of course, is consensus among its members, and there is no consensus. And as my friend Mr. Yi has said, there is certainly need for reform. And why I'm very concerned is I don't see all of that happening in a time frame. There are some initiatives, one from my own country, Canada, which has put a group of middle-sized countries together. The European Union has a set of circumstances. So there's a lot that needs to be done and change, but I'm not sure that we have the luxury of time in doing that, and I think that we are going to find a crisis situation over the next 12 to 18 months in terms of that side of the multilateral trading system. And sometimes out of disruption comes creativity. So I hope that that will be the case this time.
But hope is not a strategy, as you may know.
Exactly.
Mr. Kwong, your input.
Yes. Following Mr. Yi's comment, I would like to read one paragraph. This is joint statement by Global Business Coalition on Global Trade Issues in July 2018. You asked me to be straightforward.
Yes.
So
Don't we like
it says we should improve the functioning of WTO, more strongly compel compliance with multilateral rules, and improve the dispute settlement process of the WTO. So not only WTO, but also OECD, World Bank, I think international organizations, they didn't do enough their responsibility. I think first you should streamline and shorten dispute solving system. And you should prepare for coming new technologies, AI, drone, fintech, and intellectual property rights. And also, you should educate people. Free trade and then multilateralism is good not only for your country but for the people.
Mr. Kwong, I have to remind you though, just to be fair, you can't blame an international organization, which is consensus-based organization, for so-called its failure. Because the member countries of that international organization, I'm not here to come to your rescue, Mr. Yi. You have to answer the question anyway. But it has to do with the members of that organization, which is to come to a decision. Yes.
I used to be ambassador to the OECD, Korean ambassador to the, I know how international system is working. And then I used to be government official, minister of government policy coordination, retired 10 years ago, 8 years ago. So you cannot escape, run away from your responsibility.
You cannot. You can't. No matter how fast you run, catch them when we can. Mr. Yi, I have to come back to you. I'll go to you, Mr. Chow, a bit later about the business community. But Mr. Yi, since Mr. Kwong wants to throw all the arrows at you, rather your organization, let me just put it into another way, which is if we talk about upgrading, WTO is only one of those in the international governance system that needs to be upgraded. That we all agree, don't we? Needs to be upgraded or not? Should we have a hand from the audience? Yes or no? Yes? Okay, all right. But the even more important question to be asked is to upgrade with what principle? Right? What is fairness? What is inclusiveness when the updating of the system is being done? Mr. Yi, I think that's a question I want to ask you about.
I think first of all, I appreciate the negative comments from Mr. Kwon. Not only on me, on WTO. I think it's a fair comment. And the WTO is not perfect. And people criticize it for slow decision making, for long time lack of any agreement. We realize that. But now the good news is our members are seriously discussing how can we improve it. And they are actively trying to identify those areas for improvements. And the first one is like what Mr. Kwong commented. How can we have a speedy and effective resolution of disputes and a kind of a quick agreement. And number two, how can we avoid unilateral measures and protectionism? And number three, how can we address unfair trade or distorting trade practices, even they are not covered by the existing disciplines?
Yes.
And how can we improve the current work? And finally, how can we improve the notification and the transparency? I think they are very serious to address those issues. Of course, there might be other issues emerging.
Mr. Chow, we cannot just let Mr. Yi here do a self-criticism session. That's not fair. Because every one of us, the business community, civil society, governments in different economies, and the international governance system all need to play their role. So what about the business role? Have the business been vocal when it comes to issues now existing in our trade and economic system?
Yeah. I think there's a reason why I'm sitting in the middle between Mr. Yi and then John and Mr. Kwong.
But you
keep them a little apart.
But you can't go the middle way, okay? Go ahead, sir.
No, but absolutely. I think you got to understand the business community. The business community is very sensitive to, hopefully we have a favorable environment to promote trade and businesses. And the business voice is very clear. I mean, if you look at some of the major events and just look at this survey and some of the messages from APEC to the ministers, to the governments.
What kind of messages?
talk about inclusive growth, for example. The message is loud and clear. We need better education, access to quality education. I think in the business community, in my survey, and it's clear, over 60% of the CEOs that's the number one factor.
So that's the human capital you're talking about, right?
That's part of it. That's
okay,
that's
but what about
capital.
the international governance system and the role that everyone has there in terms of improving it? What about from the business
community? If you
community?
look at the, again, messages to the governments, to the institutions, one of the major barriers expressed by the CEOs is exactly that, which is access, which is rules, fair play in terms of allowing access to markets, free flow of capital, free flow of people. That's one of the major barriers. And actually, in this year's survey, what came out this year, which is a significant increase over prior year, is 20% of the CEO, and it was 15% last year. Now it's 20%. The CEOs are saying that one of the major barriers for them in terms of trade is the movement of data across borders. And that's obviously driven by, in Europe, for example, the privacy law, GDPR, which came into effect.
Yes.
And then in China, obviously, the cybersecurity law. These are making business communities, companies, CEOs to rethink how do they actually manage their data, the data strategy, and is making it more, and how important data is today in terms of driving the new economy, the new growth, and how do they actually manage that now with constraints, barriers put up for the business community.
Mr. Campbell, obviously, with the conversation earlier, you see we have challenges on all fronts almost. It seems it's a very interesting phenomenon because you have these parallel challenges going on at the same time. But the most important thing these days people are looking at is really about trade. And that's why we are having this discussion about trade. So, Mr. Campbell, from your perspective, particularly for the Asia-Pacific economies, what is this having on our global supply chain? And will our global supply chain change as a result of that? What would that mean for us and others as well? Well, Mr. Chow, if you want to add a bit later, also feel free to do that. Mr. Campbell.
Well, I was reminded, I'm a former senior Canadian government official, and we used to say, we're from the government and we're here to help you, or not. But there's an important point here. Just to pick up your point on reform of the WTO, since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, we've had an extraordinary period of growth, basically on a Western democratic international liberal order. And we can no longer take that for granted because there are economies who have a different view of their own governance. Almost every country, with the exception of, in the APEC group, with the exception of Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand, have state-owned enterprises, for example. So we're going to have to change, we're going to have to address the WTO in a way that just doesn't go with that old model. Now that model that we have has been enormously successful because the trade has driven economic growth. It's been at about double the rate of economic growth. That is now declining. The nature of trade is changing tremendously. It's no longer commodities and goods. It's now services. It is services. It is regional supply chains. It is unbundled information technology systems that are going to change. So trade is going to be a very different, and as the old saying goes, you ain't seen nothing yet. It's really, really going to change in the next 10 years much more dramatically. So the word, we're going to have to redefine the word trade and commerce to reflect the reality of the world that we have ahead of us. And governments can't do all of this. Attitudes to this, as I said, attitudes are different, and there's a bit of a false view in my view. There's a bit of a false view that the populations are rising against globalization. I don't think that's really true. And if I give you one example, we don't have any big free trade debate any longer in Canada. We did. We had a fundamental debate, a seminal debate in Canada 25 years ago when we did the NAFTA. But today there's no argument, and Canada is a trading nation. But one of the things that I think is instructive is when we were having that debate, and it was very controversial, we in government did surveys, and we found who do workers, who do the population listen to? It turns out they listen to their bosses. They listen to their companies. So there needs to be a proselytization on the benefits of trade. And I don't know how many of you who are CEOs and senior executives in this audience have talked to your own workers about the benefits of trade, because it's not evident to people. So there is a significant role for the private sector with their own workers, and also in terms of influencing governments to get rational and to get reasonable. So I think there's a huge onus on the business community. I know that governments don't always listen in the way that the private sector would like them to, but that should not be for want of trying.
And APEC of APEC actually is doing a great job in providing solutions and suggestions of solutions every year to the political leaders. That certainly should be encouraged. Having said that, though, you talk about free trade, not necessarily the focus of discussion in Canada. I beg to differ. If you look at the news over the past few months about the USMCA, there's a huge discussion going on in Canada about free trade. Having said that, though, let me go to Mr. Kwong. It doesn't sound like you. You're so quiet, sir.
I have many things to say.
So let me lead you with questions.
I think we should not only concern and worry, but also we should give some methods, proposals to how to solve this issue.
Wonderful. Let me ask you about the solutions. Earlier we touched on slightly about the principles. The principles are extremely important when we are talking about whether upgrading, reforming, working together, bilateral, multilateral, international, all important. So to you, what should be some of the most important principles? As Mr. Campbell also mentioned, now we have a much more diversified world for the Asia-Pacific economies as well. So when you talk about the principles, when you talk about the ways to reform, how inclusive it has to be, how much it has to revolve the real reality rather than wishful thinking. So Mr. Kwong, I would like to have your input on that.
Thank you, thank you. This is very important and critical issue because we are seeing the general people's voice against the free trade because they misunderstood losing their jobs coming from immigration, coming from cheap Chinese goods. So Brexit happens and then strong support to Mr. Trump at the Rust Belt. So therefore, we need to educate our people in democracy. The way we can do it, as I said, first strengthen the functioning of WTO, OECD, and IMF, World Bank. Second, we should let people hear our business voices like APEC, or OECD, we have PIAC. And using many occasions, we should educate and speak out. It's good for you. Then, and third thing, it's important thing, we should make more ladders of opportunity for young people by education, training. And also, we should do to reduce the divide of the minors, like giving them new training, new education for new skills, new techniques, because AI, drone, new things are coming,
right.
Fintech, so education. And firstly, we should do something for inclusive growth, which was proposed by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, Sustainable Development Goal. So using this occasion, I would like to advertise our event, which will be held 18th, 19th November in Seoul. We are hosting Regional Boao Forum. And then the Minister Wang Yung is coming, Secretary
Okay.
General Ban Ki-moon giving his speech because he's chairman of board.
Wonderful. Wonderful to learn. There are a lot of momentum going on within the Asia Pacific region. Having said that, though, let me go to you, Mr. Chow, to share with us further about the thoughts coming from the business community, mainly multinationals that you are looking into. The parallel solutions Mr. Kwong mentioned certainly is a beautiful picture, but we do share the concern of Mr. Campbell said earlier that the speed of this change might not be necessarily catch up with the urgency that we are facing right now. So let's talk about the urgency. If we're talking about the urgency, we need to have immediate solutions of multilateral, bilateral, international ones, platforms. We see, Mr. Chow, CPTPP, for example, that's quite widespread in this region. We also see the discussion of free trade area of Asia Pacific. That's a great goal for Asia Pacific region. We also see, in North America, there's something called USMCA, which Mr. Campbell have more say to than us about that. So you see these different options. To you, the business community, how do they see these options? What are some of the messages coming out of these recently developing options?
It's actually a great question. If you look at the survey results, and actually what is telling you that the business community, the CEOs are pretty agile, and they adapt very quickly to situations, despite many of the challenges that we just talked about. What we're finding from the CEOs across the 21 APEC economies is that they're actually pretty agile. And you talk about some of these regional trade deals that are being put together. The CPTPP, which is effective December 2018, et cetera, et cetera. And what our CEOs are telling us at this point is actually they are, and 31% of them are saying that they expect new revenue opportunities from these trade pacts that's happening. So they are switching and they are looking at the strategy and looking at each of these and looking for opportunities to increase their business opportunities. So that's one piece. And the other piece of actually positive news, despite the challenging environment, and again tells you how agile the business community is in terms of not just looking at things like gloom and doom, my business is affected. They're looking for opportunities. A net 51% increase, a net 51% of the CEOs are planning to increase the level of investments in the next 12 months, despite what's going on.
Where?
So actually, that's a good question. Top on the list is Vietnam again. It was Vietnam last year. China comes second, despite some of the challenges today. The USA is in there. But those are the top three. But the country, or the country, one of the economies that got dropped out of the top five is actually Indonesia. And there are many factors affecting how CEOs are making their investments, whether it's, the logistic capacity, et cetera, right. The tax system. But that's interesting. And what has actually made it to the top five is actually Australia this year. But the main message here is the CEOs are not just sitting back and says, I'm going to suffer. They're actually creating more employments. They're actually looking for opportunities. They're actually adjusting themselves. And the big question is, and you're seeing some of that happening today, is some of these trade concerns and frictions today is moving and looking at their manufacturing facilities and making some of those adjustments. And Vietnam is a big beneficiary in this situation at this point.
We want to congratulate the economy of Vietnam,
yeah.
But the prosperity of Vietnam is not solving the problem that we're all facing today.
No.
That's why we're here discussing. The hope is not about one economy. The hope is about 21 economy in this region.
Exactly.
So let me go to you, Mr. Yi, since we're talking about the group. How to address this once again? The other gentlemen have already raised their suggestions coming from different perspectives. So WTO is not the only one. But what should be the principles? I asked you that question earlier, but I want to do it again. Whether it's WTO or other trade mechanisms, what should be some of the updated principles that we should look at?
Well, I think it's up to all members to decide.
That's right.
What kind of reforms they want, what they are going to do, but clearly they need to act. They need more than talking with each other. And I think what we are talking and what we are seeing in this region is a kind of shift of global value chains. The global value chains and the regional value chains has been disrupted by this current tariff escalation. So the investment moved to other more expensive locations. It's not really healthy for the global production. And both China and the US will be hurt. So we need to act urgently to address that kind of trade concerns. And we need to have updated new rules to govern the 21st century global trade.
Mr. Campbell, I also want to call upon you about that too. Like Mr. Yi just mentioned, the trade war, apparent trade war at least, going on. Some regard it as a strategy.
I'm not sure it's just apparent.
Okay. Some suggest it was a strategy by some economy to negotiate with the others to put them into the trade war so that they have an upper hand. Well, I'm not sure about that either. So, Mr. Campbell, what should be the principles when the international community are looking at this trade war and come to sense about how to deal with it and call upon those that are involved to deal with it?
Well, we certainly have all been calling upon those involved to do something. And I mean, to be fair, it's not just one issue or one-sided. The tarification and the retaliation, I mean, even retaliating on the tariffs that have been imposed on steel and aluminum, for example, even retaliating is not in your own self-interest, because in effect you're putting a tax on your own people. I mean, any economist would tell you, don't do that, but politically you have to do that.
It's a vicious cycle.
It's a very very vicious cycle. And a number of countries who have been the subject of these tariffs have gone to the WTO, raising this challenge. And what I worry about is we're moving into, we have been and we're moving into an area of managed trade. And management is the heavy hand of government and politics. And business really has to resist this, because this introduces inefficiencies, impediments in the flow, and it increases the cost for consumers. So I don't have an answer on all of this. And it's not just tariffs. There's a whole set of issues of intellectual property, forced transfer of intellectual property, and alleged intellectual property theft. There's a whole set of issues that are out there that are very, it's a pretty rich meal to try and to digest. But underneath it all, I think we should not operate, we cannot operate on the basis of it being a zero-sum game. I mean, trade and open markets benefit everyone.
Right.
And that message has to be pushed and pushed at all of our politicians who are tempted to do otherwise.
Mr. Yi, agree?
I think my message is very straightforward. I think now it's time to strengthen the global cooperation. We need more global cooperation, not less. So the only answer to address the trade tensions is through cooperation.
Mr. Kwong, may I?
Yes, I think we need to educate people. Free trade, they reduce world poverty from 60% to 10%. So we need to educate and then let dropouts, fallouts, retarded, underprivileged have chances to become rich again. So that's what each government should do, and internationally we should strengthen the role of WTO, IMF, and then they speak out using APEC CEO Summit or BIAC to make people know the importance, the benefit of free trade.
Mr. Cho?
So, we've heard a lot of stuff, and I think one thing we haven't touched on is the role of technology. And I think the role of technology, if we talk about reform, things that we need to change, just understand the role of technology that's driving a very different nature of trade and actually driving significant growth in trade. And what does that mean as we look at some of the reform that Mr. Yi talked about and some of the challenges and some of the things that we need to deal with going forward. We shouldn't ignore that. And the business community is certainly not investing heavily in technology and driving new products or businesses.
We are having the APEC CEO Summit this time in the country of Papua New Guinea. This is a very interesting case study because that really demonstrates the region has been transforming, that developing country or even the least developed countries have catching up. So what are their needs? Should we have more inclusive growth also in the region? How our policies are being designed? What some of the bigger players are doing and what might be the impact onto the others? And how should they be responsible? Everyone be responsible. So I think we had a very good discussion today. Time is very short for such a grand discussion. If I can, ladies and gentlemen, can we put our hands together and thank the gentleman on the stage for being direct, straightforward. Thank you so much. And I would audience, thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights on globalization and navigating future challenges. Can we please have another quick round of applause as they leave the stage? Ladies and gentlemen, yeah.
This way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'd like to ask you to please remain seated as we prepare for the next session. Later in the day, you'll hear from global figures and thought leaders